A man is fired out of a cannon at 60 miles per hour. For a second, it works. He's on the perfect arc. His body is rigid, aimed like a projectile, exactly where the math says he should be. Then he looks down. The net is gone. Not moved. Not missed. Just not there. The impact doesn't kill him on contact. That's the part people don't understand. There's a brief window where the brain stays online, where you're still conscious, still falling, still watching the ground rush up, and you can't negotiate with gravity. Because this wasn't an accident. This was an attempt. A world record is supposed to be proof that humans can push a limit. But some limits don't get pushed. They get paid for one body at a time. And that's why entire categories quietly disappear from record books. Not because the numbers were fake. Not because someone cheated. They vanish because the incentive is the problem. The moment you reward the next person for going farther, staying longer, holding more enduring, hotter, diving deeper, you turn the record into a countdown. A few years later, a different person tries again. The setup looks safer. The crowd looks bigger. The margin for error is still the same. And the outcome is too. Number 10, the human cannonball distance record. The human cannonball was never meant to be impressive in a scientific sense. It was spectacle. In the early 20th century, circuses discovered that nothing drew a crowd faster than the idea of a human body being treated like ammunition. The premise was simple and easy. To sell, a person climbs into a cannon, an explosion goes off, and a human being flies through the air like a shell from artillery. What most audiences didn't realize was that the cannon itself wasn't firing the performer. The explosion was mostly noise. The real force came from compressed air or powerful springs hidden inside the barrel. That distinction didn't make the act safer. It only made it quieter. The rule for the record was brutally straightforward: fly farther than anyone else and survive. Survival depended on one thing: landing in the net. The net was usually no larger than a tennis court, sometimes smaller. It had to be perfectly positioned at the exact point where gravity, velocity, and angle all agreed. Miss it by a few feet, and the performer didn't fall. They impacted. At 60 miles per hour, the human body doesn't bounce. Bones absorb force until they fail. Organs keep moving even when the skeleton stops. The math behind the stunt had no tolerance for improvisation. A slight change in wind speed, a half-degree shift in launch angle, a minor difference in body posture during flight. Any one of those could move the landing point just enough to turn a controlled descent into a free fall. And the performer had no way to correct it mid-air. Once you left the cannon, the outcome was already decided. In 1974, Elvin Bale, known as the Human Space Shuttle, set one of the longest confirmed flights in history. He traveled 185 feet through the air. It was clean, it was precise, and it became a benchmark others wanted to beat. But records like that came with a cost that didn't show up in the numbers. By conservative estimates, more than 30 human cannonballs died during performances over the decades. Some died instantly, others didn't. The most disturbing part wasn't the impact, it was the awareness beforehand. These performers were conscious as they fell. They had time, seconds, to recognize that the net was misplaced or collapsing or missing entirely. Time to understand that nothing they did next would matter. In 1927, Mary Connors was launched on a flawless trajectory. The calculation was correct. The angle was perfect. The net failed. She never stood up again. Guinness World Records eventually stopped tracking the category altogether. They stopped because every new attempt raised the stakes for the next performer. Modern human cannonballs still exist. The act hasn't disappeared. Today's performers use larger nets, shorter launches, redundant safety systems. They're not chasing numbers anymore. They're trying to finish the show alive. And even now, it's still considered one of the most dangerous acts in entertainment. Number 9, longest time buried alive, a coffin, a breathing tube, and several feet of soil pressing down from above. That was all it took to qualify. The buried alive endurance record emerged in the 1,960 seconds, during a period when public stunts increasingly blurred the line between bravery and self-harm. At first, it seemed almost manageable. A few days underground, supplies lowered through a tube, occasional communication with the surface. The early attempts looked controlled. Then the numbers started growing. 3 days became a week became a challenge, and eventually the goal stopped being survival and became dominance. In 1968, an Irishman named Mike Meany set the most extreme benchmark. He remained buried for 61 days. His setup was elaborate by the standards of the time. The coffin was reinforced. There was a radio, books, a signaling bell in case of emergency. Airflow was carefully managed. He survived, and that survival became the problem. Others wanted the record, but most didn't copy the preparation. They copied the headline. People began attempting underground confinement with inadequate ventilation, poor structural support, and little understanding of what actually breaks first when you remove light movement and space from a human life. The danger wasn't hunger. It wasn't dehydration. It was isolation. Inside a coffin, the brain loses its reference points. There is no horizon, no change in environment, no distinction between day and night. Sound becomes distorted. Time stretches and collapses. After roughly 72 hours, many subjects begin to show signs of psychological fracture. Anxiety spikes. Thought loops become inescapable. The mind starts generating threats where none exist because it has nothing else to process. Some people lasted 3 days before begging to be pulled out. Others came back, altered, disoriented, paranoid, unable to tolerate confined spaces for the rest of their lives. A few didn't come back at all. As attempts grew, more reckless officials stepped in. Too many participants were emerging with severe trauma. Others were suffocating due to poor airflow or collapsing soil. The record still technically exists. Mike Meany's 61 days have never been officially surpassed. But no major record authority recognizes it anymore. There's no safe way to encourage people to bury themselves and wait. No ethical framework where pushing that limit doesn't eventually produce a corpse instead of a headline. The coffin remains underground. The number remains on paper. What's gone is the audience willing to pretend this was ever a good idea. Number 8, the blindfolded drive. In 1937, a man drove 17 miles through downtown Philadelphia without seeing the road. His eyes were covered. The windshield might as well not have existed. Every decision, when to turn, when to slow down, when to stop, came from a passenger sitting beside him, calmly giving directions. Left, straight, now. Against all odds, he made it. For a while, that was enough to convince people this was a skill instead of a gamble. The blindfolded drive began as a controlled stunt. Short distances, closed roads, professional drivers. The illusion of safety came from the setup, not the act itself. Take away vision and driving stops being a learned behavior. It becomes guesswork at highway speed. But records don't reward restraint. They reward escalation. Soon attempts moved off closed tracks and onto public streets. Longer distances, heavier traffic, more variables that no voice from the passenger seat could predict. Driving is not just steering. It's constant micro-adjustments based on visual feedback, depth, speed, movement, anticipation. Remove that input, and reaction time collapses. By the time a warning is spoken aloud, the car has already traveled dozens of feet. In 1971, 3 blindfolded driving attempts ended in crashes in a single month. One of them killed someone. That was the breaking point. Guinness World Records stopped tracking the category entirely. It wasn't controversial. It wasn't debated. The risk was no longer theoretical. The record itself had become an instruction manual for reckless behavior. But removing the category didn't remove the idea. Decades later, the same logic resurfaced under a different name. The Bird Box Challenge spread online after a film popularized the concept of navigating the world without sight. People filmed themselves walking, running, and eventually driving while blindfolded. The results were predictable. Cars hit poles. Cars hit other cars. Cars hit people. The challenge didn't need a record book to exist. It only needed attention. And once again, the consequences arrived faster than the warnings. Some ideas don't require encouragement to be lethal. They only require repetition. 7 high wire without a safety net. The Wenda family treated gravity as a tradition. For generations, they performed high-wire acts without safety harnesses or nets, balancing hundreds of feet above the ground on a cable no wider than a finger. What made them famous wasn't just the height. It was the pyramid. 7 people, 1 wire. Human weight stacked vertically in open air. The margin for error was microscopic. Every step depended on synchronization. Every movement transferred force through the bodies above and below. A single miscalculation didn't just unbalance one performer, it destabilized the entire structure. In 1962, during a performance in Detroit, the front man faltered. There was no dramatic buildup, no heroic recovery. The pyramid collapsed. 2 members of the family fell to their deaths. Another survived but was paralyzed for life. For most people, that would have ended the act. For Carl Wenda, the patriarch of the family, it didn't. He believed that safety equipment diluted the performance. According to him, the wire was where life happened. Everything else was just waiting. The danger wasn't a flaw, it was the point. The Guinness Book of World Records once tracked categories for the highest and longest wire walks. These records attracted performers who stripped away safety measures to make their attempts pure. And purity at that height is unforgiving. In 1978, Carl Wenda attempted one final walk. He was 73 years old. The wire was stretched between two buildings in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The conditions were not ideal. The wind was strong. The cable swayed. Someone was filming. Carl made it about halfway across before he lost his balance. For a brief moment, he hung, suspended, trying to recover, reaching for a wire that wouldn't stop moving. Then he fell. The camera kept rolling. Shortly after, Guinness quietly removed high-wire records performed without safety equipment. There was no announcement. No press release. Just absence. Modern wire walkers still exist, but most now use harnesses and backup systems. The spectacle remains. What's changed is the acknowledgement that falling isn't a failure of courage, it's a consequence of physics. Some performers still attempt unofficial walks without protection. Sometimes they don't survive. And no record book is waiting to remember them. 6 competitive eating records. The human body was never designed to be optimized for volume. The stomach is elastic, but it has limits. The throat is flexible, but not expandable on command. The digestive system assumes cooperation, not abuse. Competitive eating ignores all of that. For years, record books tracked how fast someone could eat, how much they could consume, and how far the body could be pushed before it failed. And people trained for it. Not like athletes, more like engineers, stress testing biological material. They stretched their stomachs with gallons of water. They practiced swallowing without chewing. They learned how to suppress gag reflexes meant to keep them alive. And sometimes, the failure was immediate. In 1983, a man attempted to break the record for fastest hot dog consumption. He managed to stuff 14 hot dogs into his mouth at once. Then they expanded. Bread absorbs moisture. Meat swells. The mass lodged itself in his throat, sealing the airway completely. By the time paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. The blockage couldn't be cleared fast enough. He suffocated. In 1989, a college student in California tried to break the record for eating the most peanut butter sandwiches in 5 minutes. Peanut butter doesn't behave like solid food. It binds. It sticks. It forms a dense paste when mixed with saliva. It coated his throat. Air couldn't pass through. He died before reaching the hospital. Then there were the chili challenges. Ghost peppers aren't just spicy. Capsaicin is a chemical irritant. In extreme quantities, it inflames tissue, erodes protective linings, and disrupts the body's ability to regulate itself. One contestant attempted to eat the most ghost peppers in a single sitting. His stomach lining failed. The chemical damage burned through his digestive tract. He survived, but only after 6 major surgeries. The common assumption was that competitive eating deaths were freak accidents. Outliers. Bad luck. They weren't. They were predictable outcomes of treating the body like a container instead of a system. By the early 2000s, Guinness World Records stopped tracking speed-based and quantity-based eating records entirely. The risk was no longer abstract. Each new record didn't demonstrate resilience, it demonstrated how close someone could get to irreversible damage. Modern eating competitions still exist, but they operate outside official record books. Safety rules are stricter. Medical staff is present. And even then, the margin is thin. Because the body doesn't care how impressive the number is. It only reacts when something critical stops working. 5 shallow water diving. From 28 feet into 3.5 feet of water. That was the record. At those heights, water stops behaving like water. When a body hits the surface at high velocity, the molecules don't have time to move out of the way. The surface tension becomes resistance. The pool becomes rigid. It's not a splash. It's a collision. In the 1,980 seconds, shallow water diving became a competitive stunt. The premise was simple and deeply flawed. Jump from the greatest possible height into the least amount of water, survive, and stand up. Early attempts were already dangerous. 12 feet into 4 feet of water was enough to cause injuries. But survival created confidence. And confidence drove escalation. A diver named Randy Johnson pushed the record to 28 feet into just 3.5 feet of water. The impact forces were extreme. Even with perfect form, the body decelerated faster than it was designed to tolerate. At those speeds, a deviation of half a degree is enough to redirect force from legs to spine. Vertebrae compress, necks snap, internal organs slam into skeletal boundaries. Some divers survived with shattered bones. Others didn't surface. One competitor attempted to break Johnson's record by jumping from 30 feet into 3 feet of water. He entered headfirst. They found him stuck upside down in the bottom of the pool. Guinness stopped tracking the category in 1985. There was no ambiguity left. The physics were settled. Higher meant deadlier. Shallower meant less forgiving. What made the decision inevitable was repetition. Each successful attempt convinced someone else they could do better. Each failure added another injury report. Underground competitions still happen. Quietly, without oversight, without documentation, the logic never changes. At a certain speed, water isn't soft. At a certain height, the body doesn't adapt. And physics doesn't negotiate. 4 non-stop dance marathons. During the Great Depression, exhaustion became entertainment. Dance marathons promised money, food, and housing to people who had none. The rules were deceptively simple: keep moving or you're out. Couples were allowed short breaks, usually 15 minutes every hour, but even during rest, at least one foot had to remain in motion. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Sleep stopped being restorative. Contestants learned to doze while standing, bodies swaying on instinct while the brain drifted in and out of consciousness. Hallucinations became common. People reported hearing music that wasn't playing, seeing faces that weren't there. The body can handle fatigue. The brain cannot tolerate sustained deprivation. As the hours accumulated, reaction time collapsed. Coordination failed. Immune systems weakened. Hearts already strained by constant exertion began to misfire. People collapsed mid-step. In 1923, a man named Homer Morehouse danced for 87 hours straight. He fell on the dance floor and died of exhaustion. No dramatic final move. No medical mystery. His body simply ran out of margin. Another contestant, Mary Jones, danced for 19 days. Her legs gave out beneath her. She died the following day from heart failure. The audience didn't leave. They watched couples stumble, shake, and drag themselves across the floor. Some promoters encouraged cruelty, throwing coins onto the stage to force dancers to scramble while barely conscious, just to keep the spectacle alive. Bets were placed on who would collapse next. By 1935, several U.S. states banned dance marathons outright. Too many people were dying. Too many others were leaving with permanent physical and psychological damage. Record books stopped tracking them. Not because the numbers weren't impressive, but because endurance without sleep isn't a skill. It's a countdown. What these marathons proved wasn't human resilience. They proved how long the body can be forced to function after the brain has already begun to shut down. 3 NO limits freediving. 1 breath, that's all you get. No scuba tank, no oxygen line, no second chance. No Limits freediving challenged people to descend as deep as possible into the ocean on a single breath, using weighted sleds to accelerate the fall and then return to the surface before the body ran out of oxygen. At depth, pressure rises fast. Every 33 feet adds another atmosphere. The chest compresses. The lungs shrink. At 300 feet, they're reduced to the size of oranges. The body responds by slowing the heart to a crawl. Blood shifts inward to protect vital organs. It's an emergency mode designed for survival, not competition. Then nitrogen narcosis sets in. Divers describe it as euphoria, a calm certainty. The sense that everything is fine even when it isn't. Judgment dissolves. Warnings lose urgency. Some report seeing animals that don't exist. Others feel invincible. That feeling is the danger. Divers black out without panic. Some forget to ascend. Others lose consciousness on the way up when oxygen pressure drops suddenly and the brain can't compensate fast enough. Many never reach the surface. One survivor later described seeing pink dolphins swimming beside him at 500 feet down. There were no dolphins. Just a brain deprived of oxygen inventing comfort. The officially recognized depth reached 831 feet. After that, sanctioning bodies stepped back. The deaths were too frequent. The risks too extreme. No amount of training could eliminate the fundamental problem. At that depth, the margin for error is measured in seconds. And recovery isn't guaranteed even if everything goes right. Records stopped being certified. Not because humans couldn't go deeper, but because every additional foot transformed the attempt from an achievement into a coin flip. And the ocean doesn't care which side it lands on. 2. The Sauna Endurance Contest. 110 degrees Celsius. That number alone should have ended the idea. At that temperature, the human body cannot cool itself. Sweat stops helping. Blood vessels dilate until pressure drops. Organs begin to fail not from injury but from overload. Heat stops being discomfort and becomes a systemic threat. Yet in Finland, the World Sauna Championships turned this into a competition. The rules were simple. Sit in a sauna heated to 110 degrees Celsius. Stay seated, do not leave. The last person to exit under their own power wins. There was no upper time limit, only a lower tolerance for pain. The competition began in 1999 and ran for over a decade. It was treated seriously. Qualifying rounds, officials, judges watching for rule violations, pouring water onto the stones at regular intervals to spike the heat even further. The assumption was that participants would leave before permanent damage occurred. That assumption was wrong. Heat stroke doesn't announce itself clearly. As core temperature rises, judgment deteriorates. The brain becomes less capable of recognizing danger even as the body moves toward collapse. People stop feeling pain before they stop functioning. Passing out didn't automatically disqualify you. In 2010, the finals came down to two men, Vladimir Ladysensky from Russia and the reigning Finnish champion Timo Kaukonen. 6 minutes in, both men were being cooked alive. Their skin blistered. Their internal temperatures climbed beyond survivable limits. Neither stood up. Neither spoke. They remained seated motionless until officials finally intervened. When they were pulled out, both had collapsed. Ladysensky was dead on arrival. Kaukonen survived, but barely. He suffered severe burns and acute kidney failure. He spent 6 weeks in a medically induced coma. His body had been pushed past its ability to recover normally. Before the ban, the standing record was 16 minutes and 15 seconds. After the incident, Finland permanently outlawed the competition. There was no debate about preserving tradition, no attempt to modify the rules. The conclusion was immediate and final. Turning heat tolerance into a competitive metric had crossed a line. Not because it was extreme, but because it confused endurance with denial. The body cannot tough out thermal overload. It only delays collapse. 1 water consumption records. 2 gallons of water. 3 hours. No bathroom breaks. That was all it took. In 2007, a radio station in Sacramento, California hosted a contest called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The prize was a Nintendo Wii console. The rules were simple. Drink as much water as possible without urinating. A 28-year-old mother of 3 named Jennifer Strange entered the contest. She wasn't trying to set a world record. She just wanted to win something for her kids. Over the course of 3 hours, she consumed nearly 2 gallons of water. Contestants were given 8-ounce bottles every 15 minutes. Some began vomiting. Others complained of discomfort. The show continued. Jennifer finished in 2nd place. She went home with a severe headache. She told coworkers her head hurt so bad. Later that day, she was found dead. What killed her wasn't the water itself. It was what the water did. When you drink excessive amounts of water too quickly, the kidneys can't expel it fast enough. The sodium concentration in your blood drops a condition known as hyponatremia. Cells begin absorbing water to balance the concentration. Most cells can expand. Brain cells cannot. The skull doesn't stretch. As the brain swells, pressure builds inside the skull. The swelling compresses the brain stem, the part responsible for breathing and heart rate. Once that pressure reaches a critical point, vital functions shut down. Jennifer Strange died of water intoxication. It's sometimes described as drowning from the inside out. That's not metaphor. It's physiology. The aftermath was swift. Guinness World Records immediately stopped tracking any records involving water consumption. Policies were tightened. Speed and volume-based food and drink records were reclassified as too dangerous to document. The radio station faced a massive lawsuit and paid Jennifer's family $16.5 million. The DJs involved were fired. One detail made the case even darker. During the live contest, the hosts had Googled water intoxication. They found warnings, medical explanations, clear evidence of risk. They laughed it off and kept going. Afterward, the record category disappeared completely. Not because the number was meaningless, but because rewarding excess had turned an everyday substance into a lethal mechanism. Water keeps you alive. Until it doesn't. And once that line is crossed, no record is worth remembering. These records weren't banned because they were fake. They weren't erased because someone cheated, lied, or exaggerated a number. They were erased because the pattern never changed. Each record created a target. Each target invited someone else to go a little farther, stay a little longer, tolerate a little more. And every time the line moved, the cost increased not in points or prestige, but in bodies. What these records exposed wasn't exceptional human ability. It was the absence of a stopping mechanism. The body doesn't know what a world record is. Physics doesn't recognize intention. Biology doesn't reward ambition. Remove official recognition and most of these attempts disappear. Not because people suddenly become wiser, but because the incentive vanishes. No book, no title, no one waiting to remember the number, and without an audience, the risk stops looking meaningful. The limits are still there. The danger hasn't changed. What changed was the decision to stop counting before another name had to be added to a list that never needed to exist in the first place.